17th of September, 1629. Before noon, approaching the island, we saw smoke on a long island 2 miles west of the wreck, also on another small island close by the wreck, about which we were all very glad, hoping to find great numbers, or rather all people, alive. Therefore, as soon as the anchor was dropped, I sailed with the boat to the highest island, which was nearest, taking with me a barrel of water, bread, and a keg of wine. Coming there, I saw no people, at which we wondered. I sprang ashore, and at the same time we saw a very small yawl with 4 men rowing round the northerly point. One of them, named Wiebbe Hayes, sprang ashore and ran towards me, calling from afar, "Welcome, but go back aboard immediately. For there is a party of miscreants on the islands near the wreck, with 2 sloops, who have the intention to seize the yacht." Furthermore, told that he was captain over 47 souls, who had kept themselves so long on one island in order to save their lives. This was again from the journal of Francisco Pelsaert, upper merchant and commander of the Batavia, describing his return to Houtman's Abrolhos with the rescue yacht Sardam. Perhaps he expected to find that most or all had died of dehydration or starvation. But nothing could have prepared him for the carnage and mayhem that occurred on this isolated archipelago. The conclusion of Batavia's graveyard, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello, and thank you for joining me on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. I want to give quick thanks to all of you, my loyal listeners. The show has grown with every episode, and more listeners are joining each week. It's far from Dan Carlin's audience, but in less than a year and 17 episodes later, I am grateful to have a following. I really enjoy sharing these events from history with you, and I hope you enjoy them as well. Remember, of course, to subscribe or follow, rate and review, and tell a friend. Thank you so much. Today I will share with you part 3 and final part of Batavia's graveyard. Dr. Howard Gray once again will lend his expert knowledge to the episode, and you'll hear from him throughout. This specific episode contains descriptions of murder, torture, and sexual assault. I've softened the details to not be overly gruesome, but listener discretion is advised. The Batavia wrecked just off the coast of Western Australia. I recognize the First Nations of Australia as the original caretakers of that land, and their deep connection to it. Nothing that I describe here is meant to glorify or defend the colonialism that took place in Australia or its neighboring islands. I've also included helpful maps of the Houtman's Abrolhos archipelago to help you get a visual of the layout of the islands and the distances involved. I highly recommend taking a look on shipwrecksandseadogs.com. We left off with Jeronimus Cornelisz surviving the wreck and washing up on shore of the small island we know as Batavia's graveyard, and he quickly took control of the council that had been formed on the island. With promises of food, water, and support, he rid himself of dozens of people to worry about by sending them to nearby Traders Island, Seals Island, and the islands known as the Highlands. He kept his loyal band of mutineers with him on Batavia's graveyard, but there were still about 130 people on the island, and only about 40 of them loyal to him. With plans on seizing any rescue ship that might arrive, he would need these 90 or so others out of the way. Besides, there were still too many mouths to feed. The first murder occurred about a month after the Batavia wrecked on the reef, when a man named Abraham Hendricks was caught sneaking into the supply tent and taking more than his share of wine. He also had shared some with another man, a ship's gunner named Ariaen Jacobsz. Cornelisz demanded that the 2 men be put to death. The other council members consented to executing Hendricks, but not Ariane's. Furious, Cornelisz dissolved the council, which was his right according to VOC laws, and he appointed his loyal cronies to a new council who would rubber stamp all of his wishes. This was the beginning of what was to become a violent and cruel dictatorship. The following day, Cornelisz had his henchmen kill Abraham Hendricks, driving a sword through his body. 2 more men were accused of trying to make off with a life raft, a charge that was almost certainly fabricated. These men were hacked to death later that same day, in full view of all. 4 others were secretly hauled out into the ocean and drowned. The bloodlust was spreading quickly. Cornelisz announced he would send reinforcements to those on the highland to help search for water. This again was simply a trick to get more people off Batavia's graveyard and out of his way. But it wouldn't do to simply send them to the other island to die. He ordered his men to throw these people overboard to drown as soon as they got offshore, and that is exactly what they did, drowning several people at a time, still in view of the island for all to see. They sometimes left one person alive who was forced to swear an oath of allegiance to Cornelisz. The undermerchant was ridding himself of useless mouths while also adding to his ranks. Within a week of taking control of the council, he had ordered the murders of 8 people. To the surprise of Cornelisz, on July 9th, a signal fire was seen on the highland. The survivors on the highland were led by a man named Wiebbe Hayes, and they indeed found several underground cisterns of fresh water. The undermerchant, of course, would ignore this signal, but this created another problem because with fresh water, Hayes and the others on the highland, who were mostly soldiers, would almost certainly survive until a rescue ship arrived and inform the VOC of the treachery. The people who were stranded on nearby Traders Island also saw the smoke signal. Out of sheer desperation, they fashioned flimsy life rafts out of some driftwood and began to make their way to the highland. Cornelisz simply could not have them joining ranks. He sent his men out to intercept the unstable rafts, and the mutineers easily overtook them. Some jumped into the sea and drowned. Others were led back to Cornelisz on shore to face their punishment. The Batavia's provost, Peter Jans, and his child were immediately murdered along with several others, including another child. Some pulled themselves out of the sea, and seeing Cornelisz, and not yet knowing of his treachery, begged for his aid. He promptly replied to his men, "Give them no quarter." These poor souls were hacked to death in the surf and skewered with pikes on the shore. The 3 women who remained on the rafts, too frightened to move, were dragged into the deeper water and drowned. The murders were all in plain sight of the survivors on Batavia's graveyard. Any deception or trickery was now over. Cornelisz was now ruling by fear, and his cronies lusted for killing. Some joined the undermerchant's ranks either out of fear, want for better treatment, or both. The rest of the people spent their days in horrible fear, trying to go unnoticed on the tiny island, never knowing when one of the men would feel the need to satiate his appetite for killing. Here's Dr. Howard Gray.
Once things got started and began and escalated, it sort of became a bit of a norm. And of course, Jeronimus himself never got his hands dirty. We know that in a couple of cases he said to people, well, you need to go and kill these people, otherwise you're going to die yourself, so you put yourself in that situation. Go and help kill the sick in the tent, otherwise you're going to die. Well, they're going to die anyway, maybe I better look after myself. And of course, ultimately your own survival is at his mercy as well. I sometimes sort of think maybe it was a bit like being a leader of a motorcycle gang or something, where you've got these guys, you need to be the leader, because you know that if you don't keep these guys amused by, misdeeds or mischief or whatever, then maybe you're going to be the one that they're going to turn on. And so, I think he maybe sort of got himself in a bit of a situation where he had to sort of keep it rolling along a bit until he'd pretty much run out of, obvious people to dispose of, and then he was really, got down to the stage where a lot of it became quite illogical. Let's kill the doctors, let's kill the ship's carpenters and things like that. So a lot of that became very, very little sense.
Cornelisz grew suspicious of anyone who didn't take part in the killings. But Cornelisz was not easily fooled, and he tested the loyalty of such men. In one instance, He had a young girl strangled to death in front of her mother and father in order to secure their loyalty. Actions like this resulted in more oaths of loyalty, and nobody questioned his authority. It was an inescapable waking nightmare. The killings became even more indiscriminate, and not just the result of any kind of punishment or revenge. Cornelisz was now killing for the joy of it, or perhaps out of boredom. Whatever his motivation, he showed complete disregard for human life. On another occasion, Cornelisz ordered a young man named Andres de Vries to murder all 11 people sheltered in the sick tent. Later that night, de Vries went into the tent and cut all of their throats while 2 of the other mutineers looked on, making certain that the young man killed all of them. A few days later, de Vries returned again and murdered 5 more victims who were ill. A ship's carpenter was ordered to be murdered by Cornelisz for no apparent reason other than to dispose of him. He was attacked in his tent by several of the mutineers and stabbed multiple times with daggers until he was dead. Cornelisz then turned his attention to the 45 or so survivors he had sent to nearby Seals Island. They too needed to be disposed of. He ordered his men to the island to massacre everyone, including children, sparing only the women. This order was carried out with shocking brutality, as the mutineers slaughtered men and children alike. Many who were wounded but not killed during the initial fray were dragged out into the water and drowned. This attack reduced the population by about half, with only women and a few boys left on the island. Several days later, Cornelisz ordered his men to return to Seals Island to finish them off, including the women. 4 pregnant women had their throats cut, and many of the boys were bludgeoned to death. Some of the boys were able to hide on the island, but eventually they were tracked down and slaughtered. Only 1 boy survived, and he swore allegiance to Cornelisz and joined the ranks of the mutineers. Cornelisz did not even show mercy to infants. Back on Batavia's graveyard, a crying baby was annoying Cornelisz, continually waking him from his sleep. The gruesome details of the baby's fate will be spared. 6 weeks after being shipwrecked, there were only about 60 people left on Batavia's graveyard, and about 40 of them were loyal to Cornelisz. The survivors included Gilbert Bastians, the Calvinist predicant, his wife Maria, and their 7 children and servant woman. Cornelisz simply saw them as disloyal mouths to feed. He ordered them to be brutally butchered, and Maria and 6 of the children were hacked to death in their tent with hatchets. Gilbert Bastians and his oldest daughter, 21-year-old Judic, were not in the tent at the time and were spared. One of the most violent of mutineers, Conrad von Huyssen, had become previously enraptured by Judic and was engaged to her. It's unclear if she willingly agreed to marry him or did so out of fear, but most likely the latter. By all accounts, the murderous von Huyssen genuinely loved Judic and at the very least protected her from the other mutineers. Later that same night, the bloodlust continued. Cornelisz's men lured people out of their tents with promises of food, water, or some other ruse, and then pounce on them, killing them in cold blood. Aris Jans, the underbarber, was attacked and wounded, but managed to run away from the murderers and was able to escape to the highland on an unguarded makeshift life raft. Jans informed Wiebbe Hayes and the other survivors on the highland of the murders committed by Cornelisz. This was bad news for Jeronimus Cornelisz, as until now, only those on Batavia's graveyard knew of his awful deeds. Everyone on Seals Island was already dead. Cornelisz had taken control of the island, amassed his own personal army, ordered the murders of roughly 120 people, and made life a nightmare for the few remaining on the island that were not part of his inner circle. We have not mentioned much about the women that were on board the Batavia. Cornelisz's men quickly murdered those who were either too old or otherwise undesirable. The remaining women, all young women, had been taken into what was called common service.
In the early stages where he dispersed the people to different islands, he sent off, the married women and pregnant women and such like to the other islands, and kept back some that I guess he thought were more attractive or more useful. I guess presumably in a sexual way, and so he himself eventually decided Lucretia was going to be his, and it took him a long time to get her on side through the threats that were made by some of his henchmen to her that you join him in his tent or otherwise your days are numbered. And the other women that were there, he more or less parcelled them out. It seems that they were made available to his henchmen to use as they pleased. One of them, the predicant's daughter, he married off or paired off with one of the sidekicks. Yeah, so they were in a difficult situation where their own survival was really dependent on being compliant with whatever demands were put on them by Jeronimus or by his men. So we don't know the ins and outs of all that, but in some of the trials, it's said that the men were pleading guilty to having intimate relations with these women.
By early August, there had been a pause in the killings because they were running out of people to kill. On August 6th, out of sheer boredom, Cornelisz ordered one of his men, quote, "Go and stab Stoffels through the heart. That lazy dog who stands there working as if his back is broken." Stoffels was then stabbed in the heart, as ordered. Another ship's carpenter later was killed in similar fashion by a young cabin boy. The boy had not yet sworn an oath of allegiance and had not yet participated in any of the killings. Cornelisz succeeded in ensnaring the boy's loyalty through murder. A young man named Jan Pelgrom had displayed signs of mental illness, marching about the island muttering and screaming nonsense. He was desperate to kill and had been begging Cornelisz to be allowed to murder somebody. Finally, the Captain General, as Cornelisz began to style himself, told Pelgrom to murder one of the common service women, Anniken Hardens, for reasons unknown. Pelgrom attacked Anniken, but the young man was too weak and too small to overcome her. Two other men stepped in and strangled her to death with her own hair ribbon. Disappointed and still wanting to murder somebody, Cornelisz told Pelgrom to decapitate one of the boys who repaired fishing nets. Knowing Pelgrom was too weak, another man grabbed the sword from him and ran the boy through.
One of the young men, wanted to test this idea whether you could cut somebody's head off with a single sword blow, and he amused them with that one. And what was the motivation behind it? What motivated him? How did he get these others to go along with it? Yeah, I guess it just got totally out of hand, and there was no sense of reality anymore. And I guess in the situation where they were in by that stage, any hope of surviving, being rescued, were probably fairly remote.
The murders continued, like a daily routine, making up new and fabricated reasons to execute a person, or sometimes for no reason at all. The ship's surgeon, and once leader of the council, Franz Jans, was attacked and murdered by men using swords, a morning star, and a pike, as he tried to escape on a raft to the highland. The men on the highland had plenty of fresh water, fish, sea lions, and birds. They also found a species of wallaby on the island that they took to calling cats, and they were easy to hunt. Hayes and his band knew that they could survive until a rescue ship arrived. Cornelisz knew he must deal with them.
Evidently, it would seem that Cornelisz decided that the soldiers who were, and some others who had managed to escape to what we today call West Wallabi Island, one of the high islands, where they were surviving really well. There was food, there was water to start with, and there was wallabies for food, and there was oysters, and there's fish and some vegetation, and so so they were probably getting pretty fat and sleek over there, I would imagine, but not quite different to Batavia's graveyard. And one of the things you think of is, well, why didn't Wiebbe Hayes go back to Batavia's graveyard and maybe once he knew what was going on, try and attack. But number one, it's a long way. It's several kilometres of reef-studded water to get there. It's a really difficult thing to get there. Jeronimus had the muskets, so it would have been difficult to actually mount an attack on the island without being spotted approaching. And then these guys have got muskets, and all you've got is bits of stick, or rocks to throw at people, So he really wasn't in any position to do that. But Jeronimus decided he needed to get rid of these guys, or at least get them on side.
Taking a small army of his men, Cornelisz approached across the mudflats that separated the two islands. Hayes, knowing full well of the murderous events by now, was ready. He had his men fashion weapons out of anything possible: scraps of wood, bone, nails, rocks, and rope. Cornelisz was outnumbered, and he knew it. He attempted to convince Hayes, through a letter, that the men on the highland were plotting mutiny against him. But Hayes didn't buy it. He knew what Cornelisz had done already, from the refugees that had reached the highland. Hayes was a trained soldier and selected defensive positions that worked to his advantage, and he waited for the mutineers. When the attack came during the last week of July, the mutineers were easily spotted. Hayes's men met them on the beach, and the mutineers fled, being thoroughly outnumbered by healthy, well-fed men. A second attack was planned during the first week of August, bringing more men this time. Again, Hayes and his men defended the beach, and the mutineers left without incident. By late August, Cornelisz decided to take a more diplomatic approach. He needed food and water, and the Highlanders needed clothing and blankets. Hayes agreed to meet him on the shore.
Jeronimus set the predicant in and said, want to negotiate with them. Let's see if we can do some sort of a deal. We'll come back tell him we'll come back tomorrow, and we'll bring wine and cloths and other things they might need, and we'll come to some sort of a deal. And of course, on that was the occasion that when they did come back, and Jeronimus sort of approached Wiebbe Hayes, there was no way they were going to negotiate with him, and so they actually attacked him, took him prisoner, and killed 4 of his accomplices. He thought he could fool them into coming onto his side, and it all backfired on him terribly.
Another mutineer, Walter Loos, was able to escape off the island and return to Batavia's graveyard. Cornelisz was put into a limestone pit and held as a prisoner, where he was forced to pluck seabirds for Hayes and his men. Walter Loos was elected as the new leader on Batavia's graveyard by the 30 or so remaining mutineers. He too made them all swear an oath of allegiance, and a new rod, or council, was elected. Only about a dozen or so survivors who were not part of the gang of mutineers remained. Walter Loos planned a 4th attack on the highland. His men were able to drag several muskets from the wreck of the Batavia, and Loos hoped he could stay at a longer range and pick off Hayes and his men one at a time. At 9 a.m. on September 17th, he launched his attack. His plan seemed to be working, as 4 of Hayes's men were hit and wounded, one fatally. In time, enough men could be taken down to even the odds, and Loos could attack the island on foot. By 11 a.m., the situation was looking favorable for the mutineers and unfavorable for Hayes. On June 8th, Francisco Pelsaert, Ariaen Jacobsz, and about 40 others left on the longboat and headed north up the coast of Australia in search of fresh water. Once again, here's Dr. Howard Gray.
It started out with the idea that they weren't able to find any freshwater supplies on the islands, even though later on some wells, some cavities in the limestone were found that contained fresh water. They weren't able to find anything, and very quickly, desperately after 2 or 3 days without water, they saw that this was a really, really urgent need. And so they built up the sides of the longboat, this 10-metre boat, and headed off to the mainland. Now, why they loaded it up with ultimately about 48 people, I don't know. It looked like they had the idea that maybe they weren't going to come back anyway. But the initial idea was to head to the mainland, just that 60 kilometres or so, where Pelsaert, figured that they might find some water and be able to come back with it. Once you get away from the islands, you've got understand that at the Abrolhos, the winds are nearly always southerly winds that are going to blow you north, and the seas are generally the swell and is all heading to the northward. And so coming back against that, sailing back against that, would have been pretty impossible anyway. It would have taken days and days to tack backwards and forwards and make your way back. But as it turned out, when they got to the shore, they weren't able to get ashore anyway. There's steep surf along, there's bits of reef and, waves. And as you go further north, steep high cliffs and so on. So there was really no opportunity for them to get ashore, even though they could see some smoke and evidence of people around. And once you get up past a little bit further along, there's hundreds of kilometres of really steep cliffs. And then you get up along what we call the Ningaloo Reef, which is an offshore reef, and you can't get through the reef to the mainland anyway. But fortunately, they did manage to get in there. They'd towed the little yawl behind them, and they had to throw over food and water and stuff to lighten the boat in the storms that overtook them along the way. But eventually they got ashore, couldn't find any water. They found a couple of spots, a spot later up with a little bit of rain had left a few little buckets of water around in some rock holes. And then eventually they got themselves right up to the northwest, what we call the Northwest Cape on that of Western Australia, near today's Exmouth. And then they're in a dilemma. What do we do? We're here, we're a long way, we're never going to get back. We're still something like nearly 3,000 kilometres away from Batavia. What do we do? And so they made the decision with the few resources they had, the little bit of water they had, to make that journey. And Jacobsz, the skipper who'd run the Batavia ground, got them safely up to Java. They came ashore at a little island called Nusa Lembongan, which is where they actually found a waterfall. You can imagine what it must have been like, suddenly finding water in this waterfall after these days of being at sea. Made their way around a little bit to the west into Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, and there they met ships from their own fleet and were able to obviously be all looked after, and eventually made their way around to the north coast of Java, where Batavia was situated. So that's one of the most remarkable open boat voyages of any time. 48 people on board. They all survived the whole journey. 33 days. A remarkable journey.
What Pelsaert found was a mostly destroyed and bleak town. Due to the brutality and ruthlessness of Governor General Kohn, a local kingdom called the Susuhunan had attacked Batavia. About half the town had to be evacuated, and Kohn ordered the town burned rather than handed over to the natives. Despite the town's condition, Kohn and the VOC still had a hold on Batavia. Pelsaert knew that Kohn would not be at all happy about the VOC's flagship being lost, as well as the valuable cargo. He told the tale of not only the wreck on the archipelago, but the attack on Krisia Jans and the suspicion of Ariaen Jacobsz and High Bosun Everts, who were also with them in Batavia. Kohn knew about the Abrolhos, having almost wrecked on them previously. He found it unacceptable that Jacobsz was unaware of the danger. Jacobsz and Everts were arrested, thrown into a dungeon, and Everts was most likely tortured. A VOC counselor subsequently wrote of, quote, "very great insolences, yea, monstrous actions that were committed on the mentioned ship." Jacobsz was ordered to stand trial for the destruction of the ship and VOC property, but no mention was made of the attack on Lucretia Jans. Given the circumstances, Kohn demanded Pelsaert return to Houtman's Abrolhos and rescue as many people as possible, but most important was the cargo. The yacht Sardam was outfitted with equipment, crew, and provisions for Pelsaert to be able to retrieve cargo and survivors. His orders came with a threat of severe punishment if unsuccessful. Francisco Pelsaert left Batavia on the Sardam on July 15th, and he had 3 of his men from the longboat with him. While they knew rough coordinates of the islands, they were not exactly sure where they were.
Pelsaert's heading back in the Sardam, and of course they've taken them a month to sort of get up to Batavia, and then they've taken them a month to get back in the Sardam to where they thought the wreck was. But of course, when they got there, they couldn't find it, and it took them another month to actually sailing around to actually get to the wreck site. During probably that first time when they're on their way back, that things were really unfolding on the Abrolhos.
It is now where our two story arcs come together. As Pelsaert and his crew came over the horizon on September 17th, they spotted the highland, and smoke was visible coming from the island. What they came to find was completely unexpected. After dropping anchor, a small boat was filled with food and water, and Pelsaert and a few other men rowed toward the shore. He reached the shore, but didn't see any activity. Hayes saw the Saardam approach, and he needed to reach Pelsaert first, inform him of the mutineers, and warn him of Walter Loos and the remaining mutineers. Loos and his men saw the Saardam as well, but Loos did not wish to attempt to seize the yacht. Some of his men insisted, and took a small boat headed toward the Saardam.
Wiebbe Hayes had Cornelisz held prisoner on West Wallabi Island, and Walter Loos had been elected by the remaining mutineers as their leader, and he decided, well, we better go and try and rescue him. And on the very day that they had got themselves organised and had taken off around to West Wallabi and firing their muskets, in fact, hitting a couple of Wiebbe Hayes' men, and the battle's in full flight over on West Wallabi. On the horizon, suddenly Pelsaert appears in the Saardam, or the Saardam appears, and so the fighting broke off, and the race was on then to see whether the mutineers could get to the ship and seize it, as was their intention, or whether the soldiers, the good guys, could actually get there first and warn Pelsaert as to what was happening.
Hayes was able to reach Pelsaert first using a small boat, arriving just minutes before the mutineers. Hayes quickly explained the situation and told him to go back to the Saardam immediately. Pelsaert frantically rowed back to the yacht as the mutineers came into sight. Pelsaert and his small crew reboarded the Saardam as the mutineers pulled up alongside the ship, armed with swords. The crew aboard the Saardam swung their guns around and pointed them at the small boat. After a short standoff, the mutineers had no choice but to toss their weapons into the ocean and climb aboard. They were promptly arrested, bound, and thrown into a cell. Cornelisz was transferred from the pit to the yacht later that day. Cornelisz arrived on the ship in the tattered spare uniform of his former commander and covered in bird filth. Pelsaert wrote of that moment, "I looked at him with great sorrow, such a scoundrel, cause of so many disasters and of the shedding of human blood. And still, he had the intention to go on. I examined him in the presence of the Saardam's council, and asked him why he allowed the devil to lead him so far astray from all human feeling, to do that which had never been so cruelly perpetrated among Christians, without any real hunger or need of thirst, but solely out of bloodthirstiness." Jeronimus answered that one should not blame him for what had happened, laying it on David Zavank, Conrad von Huyssen, and others who have been killed, that they had forced him and willed him to do it, that also one had to do a great deal to save oneself, denied that he had ever had the intention to help in the plan to seize the ship Batavia, and as to the idea of seizing any yacht that might come, he said Zavank had proposed this, to which he had only consented on account of his own safety without meaning it. For firstly, he believed that they would never be delivered, and secondly, that skipper Ariaen Jacobsz intended to throw the commander overboard from the longboat. In this manner, he tried to talk himself clean, with his glib tongue telling the most palpable lies, making out that nowhere had he had a hand in it, often appealing to the other mutineers who would say the same thing. He sailed to Batavia's graveyard and immediately arrested and bound the mutineers, including Walter Loos, who surrendered to him peacefully.
They kept Cornelisz separate because they thought that he still might have some influence over them, and be able somehow or other to get them to their testaments, or even mount some sort of reprisal of some sort. And so he was kept separate on Batavia's graveyard, which was where they put together the formal little committee to interrogate the mutineers and one by one find out the stories behind what they'd each individually been up to and what else had been going on.
One of the soldiers, Jan Hendricks, was one of Cornelisz's main henchmen, and he talked. He admitted to murdering 17 to 20 people on the orders of Cornelisz. He also confirmed that Cornelisz, Jacobsz, and others had planned the attack on Lucretia Jans and planned to take over the Batavia. In Cornelisz's tent, he discovered all the signed oaths of allegiance to Cornelisz, documents signed by the common service women, and other damning evidence against Cornelisz.
And to get the truth out of them, they basically used a technique today we call waterboarding, which was essentially by putting a canvas around your neck, tying it tight, and pulling it up high, and pouring water into it until it went over your mouth and eventually up to your nose. And you will tell us what we need to know. Otherwise, we will keep pouring. And very, very quickly the answers, whether it always been the truth or whether it was what they wanted to hear, was revealed, and all carefully recorded by Deschamps, who was one of the guys who eventually himself lost his life, but recorded, and we've got all those interrogations recorded in Pelsaert's journal. So through that process, they got more and more detail of what had been going on through the time Pelsaert had been away, and were able then to figure out that 8 of them were seriously involved. There's others that they wanted to find out more about, but those 8, Pelsaert decided were too dangerous to take aboard the Sardam and to spend another month or so at sea with them. Given that they would have known that they were facing a death penalty, that they would have done everything they could have to escape or cause mischief aboard. And so he decided he would execute those.
Under Dutch law, a confession under torture is not legally binding unless a confession is confirmed within 24 hours. Anyone failing to confirm would be submitted to more torture, and the process would repeat. Cornelisz retracted his confession at first, but Pelsaert was able to wear him down. Cornelisz finally confessed to all of his crimes. He showed no remorse or guilt, and knowing his fate was sealed, spilled the beans about all the other mutineers freely. All the men who gleefully followed him and willingly murdered over 120 people were being betrayed by the very man they served. Pelsaert's council consisted of several members of the crew of the Sardam, Pelsaert himself, and 2 of the survivors on Batavia's graveyard. The council decided the following, and Pelsaert announced, "Because Jeronimus Cornelisz of Haarlem, aged about 30 years, apothecary, and later under merchant of the ship Batavia, has misbehaved himself so gruesomely, and has gone beyond himself, we, the undersigned persons of the council, in order to turn us from the wrath of God, and to cleanse the name of Christianity of such an unheard of villain, have sentenced the foresaid Jeronimus Cornelisz, that he shall be taken to a place prepared to execute justice, and there first cut off both his hands, and after that punish him on a gallows with a cord until death follows, with confiscation of all his goods, moneys, gold, silver, monthly wages, and all that he may have to claim here in India against the VOC, our Lord Masters." 4 chief members of the mutineers were given similar sentences, except for having only one hand cut off before being hanged. A few others were sentenced to hang without any additional physical torture. All of them forfeited their assets to the VOC, and their families would receive nothing.
Now, execution in them was to they built some gallows on Seals Island, took them all across there in early October, and then first of all, Jeronimus was taken to the chopping blocks where his hands were cut off, and as these evil hands will never do evil again. And then he was taken to the gallows, and the gallows were not a drop hanging, but they'd just be hauled up.
He had been defiant all the way to the end. Pelsaert wrote, "He could not reconcile himself to dying or to penitence, neither to pray to God nor to show any face of repentance over his sins. And so he died stubborn." Cornelisz Jans wrote, "He died as he had lived, not believing there exists devil or hell, God or angel." The Terentian feeling, referring to Johannes van der Beek, had spread thus far.
So one by one, the 6 others were had a hand cut off and were hauled up. And then at the last minute, one of the young cabin boys was pleading, that he didn't want to die, and so Pelsaert had mercy on him and gave him a reprieve.
Pelsaert and his crew of the Sardam battled rough seas and violent gales and struggled to recover any cargo. By early October, only a brass cannon, Pelsaert's casket of jewels, and a box of silver were recovered. Finally, in late October, the weather cleared, and his crew were able to bring up 10 of the 12 chests of silver coins. Another was pinned under a sunken brass cannon, and the last was destroyed and pilfered by the mutineers. Most of Pelsaert's jewels were found, and he ordered every scrap possible of the Batavia to be returned to the VOC. This included old and tattered sailcloth, rusty barrels, clothing, and literally every piece of debris that could be found. They scoured all of the small islands of the archipelago where survivors of the Batavia had been. Pelsaert ordered the skipper of the Sardam and 4 other men to take a small yawl to search for a barrel of vinegar and driftwood from the Batavia along the reef. They were ordered to come back later that night, but to stay longer if needed. They didn't return, and their boat was spotted well offshore, many miles away. 2 days of strong storms prevented Pelsaert from searching for them, and the 5 men were never seen again. After searching every square inch of the islands and every scrap of cargo, the survivors and crew boarded the Sardam and left Houtman's Abrolhos on November 15, 1629. Aboard were 77 survivors, 45 of which defended the highland with Wiebbe Hayes. 29 were mutineers. 5 were women, including Lucretia Jans, and only 6 men from Batavia's graveyard who never joined Cornelisz and his gang. About 30 mutineers who had signed oaths to Cornelisz remained under guard. The chief among them were sentenced to be keel-hauled and then flogged with 100 lashes. Keel-hauling is a brutal punishment. This involves tying a man and dragging him underneath the boat repeatedly across the barnacles in a torturous ritual. The remaining mutineers would be transported back to Java, where they would be interrogated. Waterloos, who assumed command of the mutineers after Cornelisz was captured, along with the unstable cabin boy, were taken to the west coast of Australia and marooned there. This historically marked the first Europeans as permanent residents on the continent of Australia.
So instead of executing Dubai, the young cabin boy, and also Waterloos, who was had become the leader of the mutineers, he sentenced them to marooning, and the idea was that they would put them ashore. So when they left the islands, the next morning, the 16th of November, I think it was, they came close to the shore, and they put them overboard in a little yawl, a little boat, and said, here's some basic food and supplies and a few trinkets and other bits and pieces. Take yourself ashore. Good luck, if you're still here and you see a ship going by, maybe you can signal and we'll rescue sometime in the future. So we know they were put over the side and sent ashore. I guess the Sardam sailed away. It would have probably been a few hundred yards offshore, and they would have then had to make their way across to the shore, presumably get through the surf, or whatever the edge was. There's no real still water there anywhere along there. We think probably near a little place that today is called Port Gregory, and where a lot of Aboriginal people were living at the time. We know there were lots of Aboriginal people there, so there would have been people there. Whether they made it ashore and whatever happened to them if they did make it ashore, we don't know. There's no evidence of any sort around that. There's obviously been some interest in whether there's DNA traces, but of course this was a long time ago, and these might have been, as far as we know, the first Europeans to be possibly living on the Australian continent. Later on, well, there were other shipwrecks, and people went missing, and so on. They could have made it ashore. These were possibly the first, but any evidence of that is of their making it to shore and what might have happened to them, there's no evidence at all that we know of. Maybe some DNA evidence might come along one day.
Only one man was designated to have his case overheard by Governor General Kuhn at Batavia, and this was Cornelis's right-hand man, Stonecutter Peters. Pelsaert and the Sardam arrived in Batavia on December 5th, over 6 months after the ship was stranded on the reef. The mutineers were all hauled into the dungeons, where Ariaen Jacobsz remained.
Pelsaert had, I guess, some ways reprieved himself in that he had at least recovered 10 of the dozen chests of silver and a few other bits and pieces, and some people and such like some of the survivors as well. Fortunately for him, Jan Petersen Kuhn, who was the VOC Director General in Batavia at the time, had, during the time between the longboat arriving in Batavia, where Pelsaert had been ordered back by Jan Petersen Kuhn to the wreck, and but by the time Pelsaert came back again with the Sardam and the mutineers that he still had and the survivors, Jan Petersen Kuhn had died, which was probably a little bit just as well, because he had a reputation for being totally ruthless, and he still would have had unfinished business with Pelsaert.
Jaak Speks was named as the new Governor General. Speks did not accept Pelsaert's lenient sentencing. 5 more men were found to have contributed significantly to the mutiny and were hanged. Several more were sentenced to a flogging and exile, and Stonecutter Peters was to receive a fate far worse than any. He was to be, quote, broken from under upwards, and the body put upon a wheel. This was a particularly savage punishment, the worst in fact available to a VOC Governor General. The victim was to have his bones smashed, little by little, working inwards from the extremities, until his body could be bent and wrapped around a wheel and tied in place. His ribs were smashed as well to make his torso more malleable. He was then put on display and most likely died the next day. A handful of mutineers who were later found to have been involved had disappeared into the environment of Java, but were otherwise never mentioned again. To the VOC, Francisco Pelsaert was not a hero, but rather a merchant who had failed at his duties. The VOC was displeased with the loss of the Batavia and of his subsequent actions, but grateful to have recovered most of the cash and valuables. He was sent off on another mission to Sumatra to defend a VOC port against the Portuguese. During this time, the Batavia journals had reached the 17 gentlemen back in Amsterdam, and they viewed Pelsaert unfavorably. Pelsaert's financial schemes from his time in India had also come to light, thoroughly ruining his reputation. Soon, his unknown and chronic illness which had plagued him on the Batavia had returned, and within a year, he was dead. In his belongings, the VOC found jewels and other valuable items that he no doubt was trying to sell for himself. Most of his assets were forfeited, and a small sum promised to his mother was never paid. Wiebbe Hayes was promoted to captain and given a raise, recognition, reward, and then another promotion. Hayes would then disappear from all records, and it is uncertain what became of him. Gilbert Bastians wrote the only independent account of the events of the Batavia and subsequent mutiny. The Calvinist predicant was cleared of any wrongdoing by the church, but Governor General Speks remained incredibly suspicious of the minister. Bastians was sent to a remote outpost on Bandas Island, where he died of dysentery. He is buried there, on a remote island, in an unmarked grave. The predicant's only surviving child, Judith Bastians, found herself in Batavia alone, penniless, her mother and siblings dead, and her father sent off to a remote island. She married, but just a few months later her husband died. A year later she married again, but he too died of dysentery. Even the VOC felt this woman had suffered outrageously, and awarded her enough money for her to travel back to her hometown of Dordrecht, where she had inherited her late husband's estate. Lucretia Jans suffered through the tortures of serving Cornelisz unwillingly on Batavia's graveyard. She was only on the Batavia because she was traveling to meet her husband.
Once again, this is a story where we've got a little bit of evidence. It seems that she, when she got there, of course, her husband had in fact already passed away. Her husband wasn't there; he had died. She spent some time there and married another VOC officer, and as far as we know, made her way back to the Netherlands. What life after that, we know little of it, but there is some evidence. A very similar name pops up a long time later, which seems to indicate that she may have lived into her 80s before, in fact, she died. So, she may have at least lived a long life back in the Netherlands and got herself home there and actually survived there into old age. The records, of course, are fairly incomplete in places, and we can just surmise from different names and such like that we think that's what's happened to her.
The skipper, Ariaen Jacobsz, remained in the dungeons of Batavia until 1631. Despite being tortured and incessantly interrogated for 2 years, he consistently proclaimed his innocence. The VOC placed much blame on Pelsaert and Cornelisz, and while Jacobsz was in fact a mutineer, Spex could not convict him without a confession. It is unknown exactly what happened to Jacobsz, as records do not show that he was freed or executed. It is most probable that he and Zwaantje Hendricks both died in the filthy, oppressive, disease-ridden dungeons of Castle Batavia. Cornelisz's wife, Beletka Jacobsdaughter, having lost her home and her husband, lived in squalor. A portion of Cornelisz's wages were paid to her, only enough to prevent starvation. She continued to have heated disputes with her former wet nurse and suffered countless threats from the woman and her husband. By 1630, reports of the Batavia disaster had reached Haarlem, and soon after, reports of Cornelisz's vile actions were known to all. Records of Beletka disappear at this time, and it is unknown if she returned to her hometown, disappeared into obscurity, or died alone. Much of what we know now comes from Pelsaert's notes, or rather, the notes of Simeon Deschamps, who was his clerk and also one of the mutineers, which would be discovered later. Deschamps recorded the accounts of the mutineers with as much detail as possible. The events between Pelsaert's departure on the longboat and when he returned on the Saardam particularly came from these interrogations. Strangely, few men and the several women who were not mutineers were not interviewed, or at least there is no record of it. In 1647, a book was published based on Pelsaert's journal, called, in English, The Unlucky Voyage, and helped the Dutch further understand the perils of the coasts of Australia, or as they called it, New Holland. The islands of the Houtman's Abrolhos archipelago claimed another VOC ship, the Zeevik, in 1727, almost 100 years after the Batavia. The waters of Western Australia would claim several more VOC ships throughout its history. The Dutch East India Company thrived and amassed great wealth until the end of the 18th century. In 1799, the Dutch government let the VOC's charter expire, as a result of the financial crisis following the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Much of the possessions in the East Indies were taken by Great Britain, but some were restored to the newly formed United Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1814. The Dutch town of Batavia was renamed to Jakarta when it was seized by the Japanese in 1942. However, it was not until 1949, when Indonesia officially gained its independence, that this became official, with Jakarta as its capital. Jeronimus Cornelisz was most definitely a man with no regard for consequences. He certainly had no empathy for his victims. Their cries and suffering meant nothing to him. His intelligence and master of language no doubt enabled him to charm those around him and convince all around him to have no shame. His ties to Johannes van der Beek, also called Terentius, reflect the self-indulgent ways of a libertine. But the murderous rampage and horror that he inflicted on Batavia's graveyard was a category of its own.
But just to go back a bit there, with that illness, the syphilis we're talking about there with his wife, that you would suspect that there's a very good chance that he himself was infected as well, given the medical, the effects that syphilis has on your brain and so on. It could, in fact, go a fair way to explaining some of the things that happened. That illness is really quite a significant possibility in explaining some of the motivations that later on sort of drove the actions we saw unfold.
The wild story of the heretic and the Batavia was quite sensational in the Netherlands for some time. In 1840, the Royal Navy was sent to map the Houtman's Abrolhos, and record was made of beams of a ship they encountered in the southern group of the archipelago. They logged this discovery as the Batavia, and the nearby islands were called the Pelsaert group, which included, so they thought, the island nicknamed Batavia's Graveyard. Around the turn of the century, when tales of the Batavia were translated to English, it was determined that this location could not have been the Batavia. A novelist named Henrietta Drake Brockman had long been interested in the Batavia. She had a friendly relationship with the family who owned the rights to harvest guano from Houtman's Abrolhos, and she was made aware of the many artifacts being found there, including human skeletons. She also discovered in Pelsaert's notes his reference to wallabies, so he must have been on the islands in what is now considered the Wallaby Group, which was 50 miles to the north of the Pelsaert Group.
She, through her family connections, a young shipwreck hunter, a guy called Hugh Edwards, was keen to try and track down this wreck. And eventually he, with some others, started searching the reefs around where she thought it might be. And they got pretty close to where the wreckage was. And one of the local fishermen who'd been setting his lobster pots along the reef there, figured out they were getting pretty close to where it was, a guy called Dave Johnson. And when he realised they were getting pretty close, he said, "Look, come on, I know where it is. I'll come and I'll show you where there's bits and pieces on the floor there." And so local coastal man, Max Kramer, who was working with Hugh Edwards, went out and they dived on it and pretty quickly found enough evidence to realise that this, in fact, Noon Reef was the site of the wreckage. It was a mystery for a long time, but eventually, and often for a long time, sort of was in the southern group, which is like 60 kilometres away or more. But eventually it was tracked down. This must be near where it is. And one of the local fishermen eventually sort of put the shipwreck hunters onto the site.
It turned out Johnston had discovered the Batavia unknowingly several years prior, and had come across human skeletons but never said a word to anyone. Max Kramer became the first person to dive into the Batavia on June 4th, 1963. Excavation of the ship began in 1972, conducted by the Western Australia Museum. All the riggings and upper portion of the ship were gone, destroyed and carried away by the powerful currents. But the entire stern was excavated and was surprisingly well preserved.
In the early stages, this is 1963, the looting any treasure and stuff that you could find on these shipwrecks was pretty much the way things went. But fortunately, Hugh Edwards and Max Kramers and others involved at the time recognised that, these things might have had a monetary value to, collectors and such like, but there was in fact a much bigger story to it here and an archaeological value to it. And so they were a little bit more methodical about the way they went about inspecting the wreck. These are just private people. They brought in the Navy on an expedition fairly early on, and they insisted on setting some gelignite off on the top of the wreck site to expose more of it, because you can imagine, after 400 years, 350 years sitting on the bottom, it's all grown over with coral and algae and all sorts of stuff, and you can't see too much, it's all underneath, so let's blow the top off and see if we can expose. And so they did that. Of course, that was a pretty awful thing to have done, but soon afterwards, the West Australian government got involved and set up in the early 1970s, number one, well, first of all, some rules around, that basically the site is protected, and then set up a maritime archaeology department in the West Australian Museum. And during the 1970s and 1980s, they conducted some really systematic excavations of the wreck site itself. going down into, layer by layer and retrieving the materials and properly conserving them, taking them back to Perth and properly conserving them. And in thousands, over 20,000 artefacts, from the obvious things like cannonballs and cannons and all of those sorts of things. Lots of ship timbers, was about a third of the one end of it was still cemented into the reef, even down to the finer details, of all of the, cutlery and crockery and even lace from some of the garments and stuff cemented into the coral. So quite a remarkable stories coming out of what was actually on board the ship at that particular time and filling out the whole story around it. So the shipwreck site itself was, for the maritime archaeologists, a real treasure trove. And of course they found some of the remaining chests of silver that was remaining there as well, thousands upon thousands of coins, silver coins.
In 1972, the government of the Netherlands granted the rights to all Dutch shipwrecks in Australian waters to the government of Australia.
In actual fact, they belong by law apparently to the Netherlands government, but there's an agreement between the Australian and Netherlands government. Netherlands, of course, has lots of such archaeological material, more than they know what to do with. If you've ever been to the Rijksmuseum or the Maritime Museum in Amsterdam, which I can recommend to you. Yeah, so they have all been conserved, and a lot of it, the remains of the ship, have been reconstructed in a display in the Maritime Museum Shipwrecks Gallery in Fremantle, and there's other material in Geraldton Museum as well. So all of the material has been conserved. Some terrific displays have been put together in those two places. Some other bits and pieces are in small bits in other places, but that's where the two major sites for all of this archaeological material.
19 of the roughly 70 people who died on Batavia's graveyard have been recovered. Most of them were haphazardly thrown into mass graves. Serious injuries can be seen on the bones as a result of sharp and blunt objects, and many show evidence of malnutrition, including scurvy. One body was found with a gunshot wound, and only one person died in this way. This was Jan Dirks, one of Wiebbe Hayes' men who was defending the highlands. On West Wallabi Island, where Wiebbe Hayes' men were located, a stone fort can still be seen.
There's been discoveries on the islands themselves. We found the stone forts, as they're called, that were the little structures left behind by Wiebbe Hayes on West Wallabi Island. There's another structure on Seals Island. And on Beacon Island, Batavia's graveyard itself, they've been systematically working through that at different times. Skeletons have been exposed. There were fishermen living on the island, and they'd dig a hole for a clothesline prop or something or other, and a bit of skeleton would pop up. And these have been systematically explored over the decades. And look, they've used radar penetrating techniques to find out where there might be little patches of sand amongst what's essentially coral, lumps of coral the island's pretty much made up of, and found, now they've got traces of, I think, 21 different skeletons that they've found on Beacon Island itself. Some of them nice, neat burials, but a couple of them really just the body's just thrown into a pit and covered over. So this once again leads to, sort of filling out and authenticating what we find in Pelsaert's journal. Even some quite horrific things, like over on Seals Island, the stories there talk about how the mutineers chased down the survivors there using things they called morning stars, which is basically a lump of lead rounded around the end of a stick with nails stuck in it, and they use this to beat people over the head. Well, one of those lumps of lead with the nail holes in it has been found on Seals Island, so it authenticates the stories that come through in Pelsaert's journal.
A full-sized replica of the Batavia was built by master shipbuilder Willem Vos, completed in 1985. The replica was built to exact specifications, using materials and methods that were available in the 17th century. It sailed several voyages before being permanently docked and on display at the Batavia Werf in Lelystad, Netherlands. The headquarters of the VOC, the East India House in Amsterdam, still stands and has been declared a national monument. It is currently being used by the University of Amsterdam. The Houtman Abrolhos archipelago is now a national park and a popular tourist attraction for diving, snorkeling, and eco-tours. The tamer species of wallaby, or Hayes's cats, can still be found on the Wallaby Island group. The archipelago can be reached by ferry, charter boat, or a scenic flight tour. That is going to do it for the story of Batavia's graveyard. Thank you again so much to Dr. Howard Gray. Dr. Gray has written several books, including the novel Lucretia's Batavia Diary and the nonfiction Spice at Any Price. You can find his books at westralianbooks.com.au, and also you can follow Dr. Gray on Facebook. Links, images, maps, and show notes related to this episode can be found at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show at ShipwrecksPod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and on Mastodon at ShipwrecksPod at C, that's the letter C, .in. Also, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and tell a friend. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret and on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Thank you again for joining me, and next episode will be in 2 weeks. Until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.
And even there, over on Seals Island, on one of the archaeological investigations, they found a severed hand amongst all of the vegetation on the island. This bloodied severed hand. It was actually a prop left over from when they were making a movie reenactment of the hangings on the island, a plastic hand with congealed blood on the end of it. But you can imagine what that must have been like, suddenly coming across this amongst the bushes on Seals Island, where this bloody, and that's one of the displays in the museum. Actually, is this bloody severed hand.